Sometimes the most important moments in life come when no one is watching. Sometimes a man must choose between what the world expects and what his heart knows is right. The wedding feast was ready, the bride waiting, but Bjarke Thrainsson was nowhere to be found. The giant warrior they called Stoneback had vanished from his own ceremony. Across the water, smoke rose from the burning Jarl's hall. Raiders had struck in the night. Inside the flames, Eira Skaldsdottir was trapped beneath fallen timber, calling out as fire crept closer. Everyone else had fled, but Bjarke heard her voice through the chaos. He had to make a choice that would change everything. When duty calls in two directions, which path does a man follow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry across the fjord like a bell. Bjarke Thrainsson stood at the edge of his family's longhouse, watching the sun paint the water gold, and tried to convince himself that this was the happiest day of his life. At 6 feet and 8 inches, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, Bjarke had earned his nickname honestly. Stoneback, they called him, for his ability to stand unmoved against any charge, any blow, any force that sought to topple him. His shield, iron-reinforced and bearing the raven sigil of his clan, had never been broken in battle. His reputation stretched across 3 kingdoms, and songs were sung of his deeds in halls where he had never set foot. Yet this morning, the weight of that massive shield felt heavier than usual where it rested against the longhouse wall. "You look like a man preparing for his funeral." "Not his wedding," said a familiar voice behind him. Bjarke turned to see his cousin Magnus approaching, already dressed in his finest wool and leather for the ceremony. Magnus was everything Bjarke was not. Quick-witted, silver-tongued, comfortable in the political waters that Bjarke found treacherous. Where Bjarke spoke with his axe, Magnus spoke with words that could cut just as deep. "Perhaps there is little difference," Bjarke replied, his voice carrying the dry humor that only those closest to him ever heard. Magnus laughed, but there was concern in his eyes. "Eira Skaldsdottir is a fine woman. Her father brings wealth and strong alliances. Your children will want for nothing." "Aye," Bjarke said, turning back to the water. "They will have everything except a father who chose their mother for love." The words hung in the morning air like frost. Magnus stepped beside his cousin, following his gaze across the fjord to where smoke from cooking fires rose from the scattered settlements. In the distance, the Jarl's hall commanded the highest point of land, its carved dragons and painted shields catching the early light. "Love is a luxury for younger sons and poor farmers," Magnus said gently. "You are Bjarke Thrainsson, son of Thrain the Bold, heir to lands that stretch from the mountain pass to the sea's edge. Your marriage unites 2 of the strongest clans in the region. Sometimes duty must come before desire." Bjarke's jaw tightened. He had heard these words so many times, they had worn grooves in his mind like water over stone. The arrangement had been made when he was barely old enough to lift a sword, a political alliance disguised as romance, a merger of wealth and influence sealed with vows and witnessed by the gods. Estrid was indeed a fine woman, beautiful in the sharp, cold way of winter sunlight, intelligent, well-educated, skilled in the arts that made a proper wife. Her father, Eric the merchant, controlled trade routes that brought amber from the Baltic and silver from the eastern kingdoms. The marriage would make both families wealthy beyond measure. It would also make Bjarke miserable for the rest of his days. "The guests are arriving," Magnus observed, nodding toward the path that led up from the docks. A steady stream of richly dressed figures made their way toward the longhouse, their servants carrying gifts and their weapons glinting in the sun. "Half the nobility of the northern kingdoms will witness your binding today." "Lucky me," Bjarke muttered. The ceremony had been planned for months. The great hall had been cleared and decorated with the finest tapestries, the walls hung with shields and banners from every allied clan. 3 whole oxen had been slaughtered for the feast, along with countless sheep and pigs. Barrels of mead stood ready, imported wine from the southern lands, ale brewed specially for the occasion. Musicians had travelled from as far as Iceland to provide entertainment. It would be, by any measure, the grandest celebration the region had seen in a generation, and Bjarke dreaded every moment of it. He thought of Eira Skaldsdottir, the Jarl's daughter, whose laughter could light up a room, and whose quick mind had bested scholars twice her age. He thought of the conversations they had shared during clan gatherings, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of the old stories, the grace with which she moved through both council meetings and training yards. Eira could discuss poetry with the skalds and strategy with the war chiefs, could stitch a wound or plan a battle with equal skill. She was everything he wanted in a companion, everything that Astrid was not. She was also completely beyond his reach. "I should dress," Bjarke said finally. Pushing away from the wall. "Wait!" Magnus caught his arm. "I know this is difficult, but think of what you gain. Alliance with Eric's trading network opens new possibilities for our clan. Your children will inherit not just land, but connections across the known world. And Astrid, she may surprise you. Many marriages that begin with duty grow into something deeper." Bjarke looked at his cousin's earnest face and felt a stab of affection for the man who had been like a brother to him since childhood. Magnus truly believed what he was saying. In his world of political calculations and strategic thinking, love was indeed a luxury that could be cultivated later. After the foundations of security and prosperity had been laid. "Perhaps you are right," Bjarke said. Though the words tasted like ash, inside the longhouse, his mother, Sigrid, was directing the final preparations with the efficiency of a general preparing for battle. Servants hurried past carrying platters and linens, while the cooks labored over the great fire pit that dominated the center of the hall. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread. But underneath it all, Bjarke caught the sharp smell of his own nervous sweat. His wedding clothes had been laid out on the bed. Wool dyed the deep blue of his clan colors. Leather worked soft as silk. Silver clasps that had belonged to his grandfather. Everything was perfect. Everything was as it should be for the son of a great warrior on his wedding day. Everything except the groom's heart. Bjarke. His mother appeared at his elbow, her face flushed with excitement and exertion. "There you are. Come, you must bathe and dress. The ceremony begins at midday, and already the sun climbs high." Sigrid Thorsdottir was a force of nature in her own right, the daughter of a war chief and the widow of a legend. She had managed the clan's affairs with an iron will since Thrain's death 5 years ago, and she had been the driving force behind this marriage alliance. In her mind, it was the perfect capstone to her life's work, ensuring her son's prosperity and the clan's continued prominence. "Mother," Bjarke began, but she was already bustling away, calling orders to the servants. He went through the motions of preparation like a man in a dream. The hot bath, scented with herbs, the careful grooming of his beard and hair, the donning of each piece of finery, from the soft under-tunic to the magnificent blue cloak that marked him as heir to the Thrainsson name. When he was fully dressed, he looked at himself in the polished bronze mirror and saw a stranger, a wealthy lord's son, handsome and proper, ready to take his place in the great game of politics and power. He did not see himself. The wedding horn sat on the table beside his bed, carved from the tusk of a walrus and inlaid with silver wire. It had been crafted specially for this day, meant to seal his vows with the traditional toast that would bind him to Astrid until death parted them. The horn was beautiful, a work of art that would be treasured by his descendants. It felt like a shackle. A commotion outside drew his attention to the window. The first of the wedding guests were arriving in earnest now, Jarls and their retinues, wealthy merchants and their families, warriors and skalds and craftsmen. The greatest names in the northern kingdoms had come to witness this union. Drawn by the prospect of political alliance and the promise of legendary hospitality. Among them, he spotted Eric the merchant, resplendent in a cloak trimmed with Arctic fox fur, his face beaming with satisfaction. Beside him walked Astrid, her golden hair braided with ribbons, and her dress the color of fresh snow. She was indeed beautiful, and she smiled and nodded graciously to the other guests as, befitted her station, she looked every inch the perfect bride. Bjarke felt nothing but a hollow ache in his chest. The horn sounded from the great hall, the call for the ceremony to begin. Through the walls he could hear the guests settling into their places, the rustle of fine clothing and the murmur of excited conversation. Soon they would call for him, and he would walk into that hall and speak the words that would bind him to a life he did not want. He picked up the wedding horn, feeling its weight in his hands. Such a small thing to carry such enormous consequences. After today, his choices would no longer be his own. His path would be set, his future determined by duty and politics rather than desire. From somewhere across the fjord, a thin column of smoke began to rise against the clear blue sky. At first, Bjarke paid it no mind. Cooking fires were common enough, and the Jarl's hall often hosted feasts and gatherings. But as he watched, the smoke grew thicker, darker, and more smoke began to join it. Too much smoke for cooking fires. The horn sounded again, more insistently this time. His mother's voice called from the main hall, urging him to come quickly. The guests were waiting. The ceremony must begin. But Bjarke's eyes remained fixed on that distant smoke, and something cold settled in his stomach. The wind had shifted, and now he could smell it, not wood smoke, but something else, something that spoke of destruction and fear. That was the moment when everything changed, though he did not yet know it. The moment when fate placed a choice before him that would strip away all the careful plans and political calculations, leaving only the truth of who he really was. The smoke continued to rise, dark against the brightness of the day, and Bjarke Thrainsson stood at his window with a wedding horn in his hands and fire beginning to burn across the water. The third horn blast shattered Bjarke's trance. The ceremony could wait no longer. With one last glance at the growing smoke across the fjord, he turned from the window and walked toward the great hall, the wedding horn still clutched in his massive hands. The hall fell silent as he entered. 200 guests rose to their feet, their faces turned toward him with expectation and approval. Torches blazed in iron sconces along the walls, casting dancing shadows across the rich tapestries that told the stories of his ancestors' victories. At the far end of the hall, beneath the carved pillars that supported the roof, Astrid waited in her place of honor. She looked radiant in the torchlight, her golden hair catching the flames like spun sunlight. Her smile was perfect, practiced, the smile of a woman who had been trained since childhood for this moment. Beside her stood her father Eric, his weathered face creased with satisfaction as he surveyed the assembled wealth and power of the northern kingdoms. The priest of Odin waited between them, his white beard flowing over robes embroidered with sacred symbols. In his hands he held the binding cords that would unite their lives, while at his feet lay the ceremonial sword upon which they would swear their oaths. Magnus appeared at Bjarke's shoulder, ready to serve as his witness and support. "Are you ready, cousin?" he whispered. Bjarke nodded, though his throat felt tight as a bowstring. He began the long walk down the center of the hall, past the faces of jarls and merchants, warriors and nobles, all watching him with the keen interest of those whose own fortunes were tied to this union. Halfway to the altar, a new sound cut through the ceremonial silence, the distant clanging of an alarm bell. Thin and urgent across the water, Bjarke stopped walking. The guests stirred uneasily, murmurs rippling through the crowd like wind through wheat. The priest frowned and gestured for the ceremony to continue. But Bjarke's attention was fixed on something else entirely. Through the hall's great doors, left open to welcome the spring air, he could see across the fjord more clearly now. The smoke was no longer a thin column, but a black wall rising against the sky. Orange flames flickered at its base, and even at this distance he could make out tiny figures running along the shoreline. The Jarl's hall was burning. "Bjarke," Magnus said urgently, his voice low. "The ceremony Another sound reached them then, faint but unmistakable to those who had heard it before. The clash of steel on steel, the shouting of men in battle, the screams of the wounded and dying. The Jarl's hall was not just burning. It was under attack. Bjarke's mind raced through possibilities. Raiders from the eastern kingdoms, perhaps, or outlaw bands seeking to loot the Jarl's famous treasures. But the timing was too convenient, too perfectly planned. Every warrior of note was here at his wedding, leaving the settlements across the fjord vulnerable. Someone had planned this. My lords. Eric the merchant stepped forward, his voice carrying easily across the hall. Surely some kitchen fire has gotten out of hand. These things happen. We should not let distant smoke interrupt such a joyous occasion. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eric was right, of course. What could they do from here? By the time boats could be launched and the fjord crossed, any emergency would be long past. Better to complete the ceremony and investigate afterward. Sensible, practical, politically wise. Bjarke looked at Astrid, standing patient and beautiful in her wedding finery. He looked at the assembled guests, at his mother's anxious face, at Magnus's concerned expression. He thought of the political alliance this marriage would seal, the prosperity it would bring to both their clans, the secure future it promised for his children. Then he heard it again, a sound that cut through all the rational arguments like a blade through silk. A voice, thin and desperate across the water, calling for help. A woman's voice, high and clear and terrified. He could not make out the words at this distance, but he did not need to. He knew that voice as well as he knew his own heartbeat. Eira. Without another thought, Bjarke turned and strode toward the doors. "Where are you going?" Magnus caught his arm, his grip desperate. "Bjarke, you cannot leave, not now. The ceremony, your future, is not worth Eira's life," Bjarke said quietly, and the words seemed to surprise him as much as they did his cousin. The hall erupted in shocked whispers. Eric's face went red with fury, while Astrid's perfect composure cracked for just a moment, revealing something hard and cold beneath. "You would abandon your bride," Eric's voice boomed across the hall. "Your sacred duty? Your sworn word?" Bjarke stopped at the threshold and turned back. In his hands, the wedding horn felt suddenly fragile, like something that might shatter at the slightest pressure. He looked at it for a long moment. This symbol of duty and tradition and everything his life was supposed to be. Then he set it carefully on the nearest table and walked out into the bright spring day. Behind him, the hall exploded in chaos. Voices rose in anger and confusion. Chairs scraped against stone as people leaped to their feet. And through it all, he heard Eric shouting demands and threats in equal measure. Bjarke ignored them all. He ran to where his boat waited at the family dock, a sleek craft built for speed rather than cargo. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he untied the mooring lines and pushed off from shore. The fjord was choppy with spring winds, but Bjarke had been sailing these waters since childhood. He bent his back to the oars, with a rhythm born of long practice, each stroke driving him farther from his wedding and closer to whatever disaster awaited across the water. As the distance closed, the scope of the catastrophe became clear. The Jarl's hall was not just burning, it was collapsing. Flames poured from windows and roof openings, while thick smoke billowed into the sky. Bodies littered the courtyard, some moving feebly, others lying still as stones. But it was the sound that truly drove home the horror. Not just the crackling of flames and the groaning of timber, but the human sounds, crying, screaming, calling for help or mercy or deliverance that would not come. Bjarke beached his boat and ran up the slope toward the hall, his wedding finery already stained with sweat and ash. The heat hit him like a physical blow as he approached the building, forcing him to shield his face with his arm. The great doors had been barred from outside, a deliberate act to trap those within. Bjarke seized the heavy timber that held them shut and heaved it aside, his muscles straining against the weight. The doors swung open to reveal a vision from the deepest hells. The interior of the hall was an inferno, burning timber falling from the roof while choking smoke filled the air. Bodies lay scattered across the floor, guests who had been trapped when the attack began. servants who had died trying to save their masters, warriors who had fallen defending their lord, and there, pinned beneath a massive oak beam carved with protective runes that had failed to save her, lay Eira Skaldsdottir. She was conscious but barely, her face pale with shock and pain. Blood stained her dress where the timber had struck her, and her left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. But her eyes were clear and focused on his face, with an expression he had never seen before. Not the composed daughter of a Jarl, but a woman facing her own mortality. "Bjarke," her voice was barely a whisper above the roar of flames. "You came. I heard you calling," he said, dropping to his knees beside the beam. She managed a weak smile. "I was not calling for you." Then you called louder than you knew. The beam was enormous, a dressed trunk of ancient oak that had probably taken 20 men to lift into place. Now it lay across Eira's legs and lower torso, its carved runes mocking in the firelight. The roof above them groaned ominously, and Bjarke could see that they had minutes at most before the entire structure came down. He braced his feet and took hold of the beam, feeling the rough bark bite into his palms. The heat was growing unbearable, and smoke was beginning to fill his lungs, despite his efforts to breathe through his sleeve. "Please," Eira whispered, and her voice carried a note he had never heard from her before, not command or request, but pure human need. "Please don't leave me." The words hit him like a hammer blow to the chest. In all his life, no one had ever asked him to stay. His mother, his clan, his bride-to-be, they all demanded his duty, his service, his compliance with their wishes. But no one had ever simply asked him not to go. "Never," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. He lifted. The oak beam fought him like a living thing. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, it refused to budge, as if the very weight of tradition and duty had been carved into its ancient grain. Bjarke's muscles screamed in protest, his back strained against forces that seemed to mock his mortal strength. Then, slowly, impossibly, the timber began to rise. Eira gasped as the crushing weight lifted from her body, and in that sound Bjarke heard both pain and hope mingled together. Her amber pendant, a family heirloom that had belonged to her mother, caught the firelight as she struggled to move, its warm glow somehow beautiful, even in the midst of such destruction. "Can you move?" Bjarke asked through gritted teeth, his arms trembling with the effort of holding the massive beam aloft. "I think so." Eira's voice was stronger now, though still tight with pain. She pulled herself backward with her good arm, her dress tearing on the rough stone floor. Blood left a dark trail behind her, but she was moving. The roof groaned again, more urgently this time. Chunks of burning thatch began to fall around them like fiery rain, and the heat had become almost unbearable. Sweat poured down Bjarke's face, mixing with ash and smoke until he could barely see. "Almost," Eira whispered. "Almost clear." Her injured leg caught on something, debris from the collapsed roof, and she cried out in frustration and fear. The sound cut through Bjarke's heart like a blade, but he could not release the beam to help her. His strength was already failing, his grip slipping on the smooth wood. "Wait," she said, and somehow managed to free herself with a sharp intake of breath that spoke of considerable pain. The moment she cleared the beam's reach, Bjarke let it fall. The crash shook the entire building, sending more burning debris cascading from above. But Eira was free, and that was all that mattered. He scooped her up in his arms as gently as he could manage, feeling how small and fragile she seemed, despite her reputation for strength and independence. The amber pendant pressed against his chest as he held her, warm with the heat of her body and somehow reassuring in its solid presence, a connection to her family's history and the mother she had lost too young. "I can walk," she protested, though the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. "Save your strength," Bjarke replied, already moving toward the door. "We are not safe yet." The journey through the burning hall felt like a descent through the underworld. Fallen timbers blocked their path, forcing Bjarke to climb over obstacles while protecting Eira from the flames that reached for them like grasping fingers. The smoke was so thick now that he could barely breathe, and each step sent sparks swirling around them in deadly spirals. Twice he stumbled, his vision blurred by tears and smoke. Once he had to shield Eira with his own body as a burning rafter crashed down beside them, the heat searing through his fine wedding clothes until he could smell his own flesh beginning to burn. But he did not stop. Could not stop. The woman in his arms had asked him not to leave her, and those words had become more binding than any marriage vow. When they finally burst through the doorway into the cool spring air, Bjarke's legs gave out beneath him. He managed to carry Eira a safe distance from the burning building before collapsing to his knees, his lungs burning as he gasped for clean air. Around them, the scene was one of utter devastation. The Jarl's hall, which had stood for 3 generations as a symbol of strength and prosperity, was now nothing more than a funeral pyre. Bodies lay scattered across the courtyard, some of them people Bjarke had known since childhood, others strangers who had been guests when the attack came. "Father," Eira whispered, her voice hollow with grief. Bjarke followed her gaze to where Jarl Skaldi lay near the well, his great sword still clutched in his hand and his shield split nearly in 2. He had died fighting, as befitted a warrior of his standing, but the sight brought no comfort to his daughter's eyes. "I'm sorry," Bjarke said, the words feeling inadequate against such loss. Eira nodded, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. He would want to know that his people were avenged. "They will be," Bjarke promised, though he had no idea how he could keep such a vow. He looked around for other survivors and spotted movement near the stables. 3 figures crouched behind an overturned cart, 2 servants and an old warrior Bjarke recognized as Orm the Faithful, who had served the Jarl's family for 40 years. "Orm!" Bjarke called out. The old man's head snapped up, his weathered face breaking into an expression of amazement and relief. "Lord Bjarke?" "But how your wedding can wait," Bjarke said firmly. "What happened here?" Orm helped the 2 servants to their feet and approached cautiously, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line for signs of renewed attack. "Raiders came at dawn, just as the morning meal was being served. They knew exactly when to strike, knew that most of our warriors would be across the fjord at your ceremony." The implication hit Bjarke like a physical blow. Someone had planned this attack to coincide with his wedding, had used his own celebration as cover for murder and destruction. "Who were they?" Eira asked, struggling to sit up despite her injuries. "Outlaws, by their dress," Orm replied. "But they fought with discipline like trained warriors. And their leader," he paused, his face troubled. "Their leader knew the hall's layout, knew where to find the Jarl's private chambers, where the treasures were kept. You think it was someone from the region," Bjarke said. "It was not a question. I think it was someone who had been a guest here before," Orm said grimly. The old warrior's words hung in the air like smoke from the burning hall. If he was right, then this was not a random raid, but a carefully planned betrayal. Someone had sat at the Jarl's table, accepted his hospitality, and then returned with sword and fire to repay that kindness with death. Eira's hand found Bjarke's arm, her fingers surprisingly strong despite her injuries. The amber pendant rose and fell with her labored breathing, catching the light from the flames that still consumed her childhood home. "My lord," she said quietly, "you should return to your wedding. To your bride. This is not your fight." The words were meant kindly, Bjarke knew. She was trying to give him a way back to his old life, to the path of duty and political wisdom that everyone expected him to follow. But as he looked into her eyes, so brave despite the pain and loss she had endured, he realized that such a path no longer existed for him. "I abandoned my wedding the moment I heard your voice," he said. "There is no going back from that." She studied his face for a long moment, and he saw understanding dawn in her expression. "They will never forgive you, perhaps, but I will never forgive myself if I leave now. Your cousin Magnus, your mother, they will be frantic with worry. Then we must send word that I am alive and safe." Bjarke looked around at the devastation surrounding them. "But first, we must tend to your injuries and give proper rites to the dead." Eira nodded, though the movement clearly caused her pain. "There is a shelter in the woods where my father kept supplies for hunting parties. We can make camp there while we decide what to do next." Can you travel that far? With help, she managed a weak smile. I seem to recall that you are quite good at carrying people. Despite everything, Bjarke found himself smiling back. Even wounded and grieving, Eira retained the quick wit and gentle humor that had always drawn him to her. The amber pendant caught the light again as she moved, and he was struck by how much strength and grace could exist in such a small space, both in the ancient jewelry and in the woman who wore it. Then we go, he said, lifting her once more into his arms. Gather what supplies you can carry. We have much to plan and little time to do it. As they made their way toward the forest, Bjarke's wedding clothes torn and stained with blood and ash, he caught one last glimpse of his boat on the shore below. Across the fjord, smoke from his family's longhouse chimney rose peacefully into the spring sky, and he could imagine the chaos that must be unfolding there, as his absence stretched from minutes into hours. His old life was ending, he realized. The life of duty and political marriages and carefully calculated alliances was burning away just as surely as the Jarl's hall behind them. What would rise from those ashes he did not yet know. But for the first time in years, Bjarke Thrainsson felt truly alive. The hunting shelter stood hidden among ancient pines, its weathered timbers blending so well with the forest that a man might pass within 10 paces and never see it. Eira Skaldsdottir had built it years ago as a retreat from the demands of leadership, a place where he could hunt and think in solitude. Now it would serve as sanctuary for his daughter and the man who had risked everything to save her. Bjarke laid Eira gently on the simple bed of furs, his movements careful despite the urgency he felt. Her injuries needed tending, and the longer they waited, the greater the risk of fever or worse complications. Old Orm busied himself building a fire while the 2 rescued servants, a cook named Helga and a young stable boy called Finn, gathered water and what medicinal herbs they could find in the surrounding woods. "Let me see your arm," Bjarke said. Kneeling beside the bed, Eira's left arm was clearly broken, the bone displaced beneath skin, already purpling with bruises. She held it protectively against her body, her jaw tight with pain. She was trying not to show. "I have set bones before," Bjarke said gently. "On the battlefield when no healer was at hand." "I know." Her voice was steady, but he could see the fear in her eyes, not of pain, but of what permanent injury might mean for a woman who had always prided herself on her independence. "Do what you must." He worked with the same careful precision he had learned in war, feeling for the break and judging how best to align the bones. Eira bore the pain in silence, except for one sharp intake of breath when he made the adjustment, her good hand clutching her amber pendant so tightly that her knuckles showed white. "There," he said finally, binding the splint with strips torn from his ruined wedding shirt. "It should heal cleanly if you rest it properly." "Rest," Eira laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. "With my father dead and his hall in ashes, how can I rest?" Bjarke sat back on his heels, studying her face in the firelight. Even injured and grieving, she was beautiful, but it was not the cold, calculated beauty of his intended bride. Eira's face showed character, intelligence, the strength that came from facing life's challenges, rather than being sheltered from them. "You cannot rebuild everything in a day," he said. "Your people need you alive and whole, not dead from fever because you pushed too hard too soon. My people." She touched the pendant again, a gesture that seemed to comfort her. "How many are left, do you think? How many died because I was not there to help defend them?" "You were there," Bjarke said firmly. "I saw how the beam fell. You were trying to help others escape when it trapped you. You'd nearly died trying to save your people." Tears gathered in her eyes, though she fought them back. "My mother used to say that leadership was not about being the strongest or the bravest, but about being there when others needed you most. I failed her." "Your mother would be proud of the woman you have become," Bjarke said, surprised by the intensity of his own conviction. "As your father was proud, as anyone with eyes to see would be proud." She looked at him then, with an expression he could not quite read, gratitude mixed with something deeper, more complex. Her fingers loosened their grip on the pendant, and for the first time since the rescue, Some of the tension seemed to leave her shoulders. From across the small shelter, Orm cleared his throat diplomatically. "My lord, perhaps we should discuss what message to send across the fjord. Your family will be wondering." "My family?" Bjarke felt a familiar weight settle on his chest. Yes, they will be wondering indeed. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in. By abandoning his wedding, he had not just disappointed his bride and her family, he had humiliated them before the greatest gathering of nobles the region had seen in years. Eric the merchant was not a man who forgave insults easily, and this was far more than an insult. It was a public rejection of everything the marriage represented. "What will you tell them?" Eira asked quietly. Bjarke was quiet for a long moment, considering. What could he say that would not make the situation worse? How could he explain that he had risked political alliance, family honor, and his own future for a woman he barely knew, or thought he barely knew? The truth was more complicated than that, and he was only beginning to understand it himself. He had not abandoned his wedding for a stranger. He had abandoned it for the one person whose voice could call him away from duty towards something deeper and more essential. "I will tell them the truth," he said finally, "that I heard someone in mortal danger and could not ignore the call. They will ask why you did not send others, why the groom himself had to go. Because it was you." The words came out before he could stop them, carrying more weight and meaning than he had intended. Eira stared at him, her eyes wide in the firelight. Around them, the shelter fell silent except for the crackling of flames and the distant sound of wind in the pines. "Bjarke," she began. "I know it is foolish," he said quickly. "I know it changes nothing about your station or mine, about what is possible or proper. But I could not let you die when I had the power to save you. I could not live the rest of my life knowing that I chose politics over what?" He looked down at his hands, stained now with her blood and the ash from her father's hall. On his finger, his betrothal ring caught the firelight, a circle of gold that had once seemed like a promise, but now felt like a chain. "Over what matters most," he said simply. The silence stretched between them. Heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to voice. Finally Eira spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your bride will be heartbroken. My bride will be angry," Bjarke corrected. "There is a difference. And your mother, your clan, will survive as they always have." He met her eyes again. "The question is, what happens now? To you, to your people, to whoever was responsible for this attack." Eira's hand went to her pendant again, and this time he saw the gesture for what it truly was. Not nervous habit, but connection to something larger than herself. To family and duty and the responsibility that came with her bloodline. "Justice," she said, and her voice carried the steel that had made her father a respected leader. "Justice for the dead and protection for the living. But first," she winced as she tried to shift position, "first we must survive long enough to seek either." From outside the shelter came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast through the forest. Orm was on his feet in an instant, his hand on the hilt of his sword, while Bjarke moved to shield Eira from the doorway. "Easy," called a familiar voice from the darkness. Magnus Eriksson seeking his cousin Bjarke. "They come alone and in peace." Bjarke relaxed slightly but did not move away from Eira. "How did you find us?" Magnus appeared in the doorway, still dressed in his wedding finery, but now travel-stained and worried. His eyes took in the scene quickly, Eira on the bed with her arm in a splint, Bjarke's torn and bloodied clothes, the obvious intimacy of their arrangement. "Orm's son saw the smoke and came to investigate," Magnus said. "He found me searching the ruins and told me where you had gone." His gaze lingered on Eira, then returned to his cousin's face. "The whole fjord knows what happened here. What they do not know is why the bridegroom vanished from his own wedding." "I had more important things to do," Bjarke said quietly. Magnus looked again at Eira, then at the bloodied betrothal ring on Bjarke's finger. Understanding dawned in his expression, followed quickly by something that might have been resignation. "I see," he said. "And what am I to tell your bride?" "Your mother." The 200 wedding guests who are currently demanding explanations. Tell them, Bjarke said, pulling the golden ring from his finger and holding it out to his cousin, that Bjarke Thrainsson sends his regrets, but he has found something more valuable than gold or political alliance. Magnus stared at the ring for a long moment before taking it. You know this means exile, disgrace. Eric will never forgive this insult, and he has allies enough to make your life very difficult. Then I will have to make a different life, with her. Magnus glanced meaningfully at Eira. If she will have a disgraced fool who has nothing left to offer but his sword and his loyalty. Eira's voice came soft but clear from the bed. That may be more than you think, Bjarke Thrainsson. More than enough. The bloodied betrothal ring lay in Magnus's palm, like an accusation, but as Bjarke looked at Eira's face in the firelight, bruised but determined, vulnerable but unbroken, he felt no regret, only a sense that his real life was finally beginning. The news spread across the fjord settlements, like wildfire in dry grass. Within 2 days, every soul for 50 leagues knew the story, or thought they did. Bjarke Thrainsson, the great warrior called Stoneback, had abandoned his bride at the altar to run off with the Jarl's daughter. The details varied with each telling, growing more scandalous and romantic with every repetition. What the stories failed to capture was the cold reality now facing them in the hunting shelter. Eric has called for a formal assembly. Magnus reported on his 3rd visit, his face grim with news from across the water. He demands compensation for the public humiliation. And he has the backing of 3 other merchant clans. Bjarke absorbed this information while sharpening his axe, the familiar rhythm of stone on steel helping him think. What sort of compensation? Your lands to start, your holdings in the western valleys, the fishing rights along the northern shore, the trading post at the mountain pass. Magnus paused. And your exile from the kingdom. From her place by the fire, Eira stirred restlessly. Her arm was healing well, but the forced inactivity chafed at her like ill-fitting armor. He cannot claim lands that belong to another clan. He can if the clan head agrees to it, Magnus said quietly. Your mother is under enormous pressure, cousin. Eric has convinced half the assembly that your actions were not just dishonorable, but part of some larger conspiracy. What conspiracy? Bjarke looked up from his blade. He claims you arranged the attack on the Jarl's hall yourself, then played the hero to win Eira's gratitude and hand. He says it explains how the raiders knew exactly when to strike, and why you were so conveniently ready to rescue her. The accusation was so outrageous that Bjarke almost laughed. Almost, but he could see the twisted logic that would appeal to those who measured all actions by political gain rather than honor. And people believe this? Some do. Others merely find it convenient to believe. Magnus's expression was troubled. Eric is offering very generous trade agreements to those who support his position. Gold has a way of making even impossible stories seem reasonable. Eira struggled to stand, favoring her injured leg, but moving with determination toward the table where several broken pieces of carved stone lay arranged like a puzzle. She had found them in the ruins of her father's hall, fragments of an oath stone that had been shattered during the attack. This is what bound you to your marriage contract, she said, touching one of the larger pieces. The stone had been split almost perfectly in half, its carved runes broken and meaningless. Sacred oaths witnessed by the gods themselves. Bjarke set down his axe and joined her at the table. It is broken now? Yes, but not by your choice. She picked up 2 fragments that had once fit together, their jagged edges sharp with recent damage. The raiders smashed it when they destroyed the hall. In the old law, that releases you from the binding. Magnus leaned forward, his interest sharp. You are certain of this? The law is clear, Eira said. An oath stone broken by enemy action voids all contracts sealed upon it. My father taught me the ancient codes when I was barely old enough to understand them. For the first time in days, Bjarke felt a spark of hope. Eric's contract was witnessed here on this stone, which means it died with my father's hall. Eira's smile was fierce despite her injuries. Eric has no legal claim to anything, not your lands, not compensation, nothing. Magnus whistled low. He will not accept that easily. No, Eira agreed. He will argue that the contract was already sealed before the stone was broken, that your abandonment of the wedding invalidated any claim to protection under the old laws. And who would arbitrate such a dispute? Bjarke asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The regional assembly, Magnus said, which Eric has been very busy stacking with his allies and debtors. They stood around the broken stone in silence, each contemplating the political realities they faced. The law might be on their side, but law and justice were not always the same thing when gold and influence entered the equation. There is something else, Magnus said finally. Mother wants to see you. She's holding the clan together for now, but Eric's pressure is enormous. There are those among our own kinsmen who think you should accept exile rather than risk the family's prosperity. The words hit Bjarke like a physical blow. His own clan considering abandonment. The people he had protected and provided for, now weighing his worth against trade agreements and merchant gold. Who? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Your uncle Thorvald leads the faction. He argues that one man's honor is not worth the prosperity of hundreds. Eira's hand found Bjarke's arm, her touch both comforting and restraining. She seemed to sense the rage building in him, the desire to confront those who would trade loyalty for profit. Your uncle may be right, she said quietly. From a practical standpoint, practical? Bjarke turned to face her. You would have me accept exile, abandon my lands and my people? I would have you consider all options before choosing the path that leads to more bloodshed. Her eyes were steady, showing none of the uncertainty he felt. Sometimes retreat is the wisest course, and sometimes it is just another word for surrender. They stared at each other across a gulf that seemed to have opened suddenly between them. Here was the fundamental difference in their situations, Bjarke realized. Eira had lost everything in the attack. Her father, her home, her position. She had nothing left to lose. But he still had clan lands, family ties, responsibilities that bound him to hundreds of people who depended on his leadership. What would you have me do? He asked. Run away with you? Live as outcasts in some distant land? If necessary. Her voice was calm, but he caught a flash of something deeper in her eyes. Pain, perhaps, or disappointment. I thought that was what you chose when you left your wedding. I chose to save your life. Everything else. He gestured helplessly at the broken stone, at the political chaos surrounding them. I did not think this through. No, she said softly. You acted from the heart, not the head. It's what makes you a good man, but perhaps not a wise one. Magnus cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps I should return tomorrow, when you have had time to consider. No. Bjarke picked up one of the stone fragments, feeling its weight in his hands. The carved runes were ancient, older than memory, speaking of oaths and honor and obligations that transcended mere politics. I will not hide in these woods while others decide my fate. What do you mean to do? Eira asked. Face them. All of them. Eric, the assembly, my own kinsman if necessary. He set the stone fragment down carefully, as if it was still sacred, despite its broken state. But first, I need to understand something. What? Who really attacked your father's hall, and why? He looked at both Eira and Magnus, his expression grim with new determination. Because until we know that, we are fighting shadows while the real enemy watches and plans. Magnus nodded slowly. The surviving servants might remember more details, given time. And there were tracks in the forest that Orm's son has been following. Then we follow them too. Bjarke moved to where his sword hung on the wall, its familiar weight reassuring in his hands. If Eric wants to paint me as a villain, let him. But I will not be destroyed by lies while the truth goes unspoken. Eira watched him arm himself, her expression unreadable. And if the truth is not enough to save you, then at least I will fall fighting for something real, he replied, rather than living as a slave to something false. The broken oath stone lay on the table between them, its shattered pieces reflecting the firelight like broken promises. But in its destruction, Bjarke found an unexpected freedom, the liberty that came from having nothing left to lose but honor itself. The investigation began with ghosts and ended with blood, orms. Sunleaf had the sharp eyes of a born tracker, and he led them through the forest with the confidence of a man following a well-worn path. The raiders' trail was 3 days cold, but the signs remained clear enough to read for those who knew how to look. 16 men, Leaf reported, kneeling beside a muddy depression near a stream. Maybe 17. They came from the east, moving fast but not carelessly. Bjarke studied the hoofprints, noting their depth and spacing. Good horses, well-fed, well-shod, not the mounts of desperate outlaws. And look at this. Eira hobbled forward on her makeshift crutch, pointing to scrapes on a nearby tree trunk. Armor marks. Mail or plate, not leather and hide. The trail told a story that grew more troubling with each mile they followed. These had not been common raiders, driven by hunger or desperation. They had been well-equipped warriors, moving with military precision toward a specific target. But it was what they found at the raiders' camp that changed everything. They waited here, Leaf said, indicating a clearing where the grass was still flattened from sleeping rolls and horse pickets. At least 2 days, maybe 3, waiting. Not striking and fleeing like opportunistic bandits, but waiting for the right moment. The moment when Bjarke's wedding would draw away the Jarl's defenders. Eira found the first piece of real evidence, a leather saddlebag caught on a thorn bush, overlooked in the raiders' haste to depart. Inside were supplies that spoke of careful preparation, dried meat of good quality, wine from the southern kingdoms, even a small pouch of silver coins marked with unfamiliar symbols. But it was Bjarke who made the discovery that turned suspicion into certainty. Half buried beneath fallen leaves lay a war axe, its blade nicked and stained, but its handle carved with unmistakable symbols. Bjarke recognized the weapon immediately. It had belonged to Eira's brother Gunnar, who had died 2 winters past defending a village from true raiders. "This was in your father's hall," Bjarke said, holding up the axe. "Displayed above the great hearth as a memorial." Eira's face went pale as bone. Gunnar's axe. Father kept it there to honor his memory. Her voice shook with a mixture of grief and rage. They took it from his shrine and used it in their attack. The implications were staggering. The raiders had not only known the hall's layout well enough to find and steal a memorial weapon, they had deliberately chosen to desecrate it, to use a dead son's blade against his own family. This was not about gold or plunder, Eira said, her hands trembling as she took the axe from Bjarke. This was about sending a message. What message? Leif asked. That nowhere is safe. That even the memory of the dead can be turned against the living. Eira's voice carried the cold edge of someone who had just understood the true scope of their enemy's cruelty. Someone wanted my father to know, in his final moments, that his son's weapon was being used to destroy his daughter. They made camp that night in a different clearing, one that offered good sightlines and easy escape routes. But sleep came hard for all of them, and when it did come, it brought dark dreams of burning halls and voices calling for help that would never arrive. It was Magnus who brought the next piece of the puzzle, appearing at their campfire near midnight with news from across the fjord. "The assembly has been set for tomorrow," he reported, settling beside the fire with the weariness of a man who had been riding hard. Eric grows impatient. He wants your answer, exile or forfeiture of lands. "And my mother's position?" Bjarke asked. "Unchanged. She stands with you, but the pressure is enormous." Magnus glanced around the camp, taking in their makeshift arrangements and travel-stained clothes. "There is something else. 3 more households have reported thefts in the past week. Small things, family weapons, personal items, documents." Eira looked up sharply. "What kind of documents?" "Trade agreements, mostly. Land transfers, marriage contracts." Magnus paused, his expression troubled. "Someone is gathering information about clan relationships and obligations." The pieces were starting to form a pattern, though its full shape remained unclear. Bjarke thought of Eric's political maneuvering, his sudden interest in generous trade agreements with those who supported his position. He thought of the timing of the raid, the careful planning that had gone into it. Eric knew, he said suddenly. Knew what? Magnus asked. About the attack. Maybe not the details, but he knew something was planned. Bjarke stood and began pacing, his mind working through the possibilities. Think about it. He calls for compensation before the bodies are even cold. He has allies lined up and arguments prepared. He moves too quickly, too confidently. That is a serious accusation, Magnus warned, but not an impossible one, Eira said quietly. She was turning Gunnar's axe over in her hands, examining every scratch and stain on its surface. My father received a message 2 days before the attack. A trader wanting to discuss new routes through our territory. Father was going to meet with him after your wedding. What trader? Bjarke asked. Someone claiming to represent Eric's interests in the Eastern Kingdoms. Eira's voice was flat, emotionless. The message came with Eric's seal. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackling of flames and the distant sound of wind in the trees. If Eira was right, if Eric had been involved in planning the attack, then everything they thought they knew about their situation was wrong. We need proof, Magnus said finally. Accusations without evidence will only make Eric's position stronger. The proof is here, Eira said, hefting her brother's axe. This weapon never left my father's hall, except in the hands of an enemy. Someone who knew its significance, who understood exactly how much pain it would cause to see it used against us. That narrows the suspects considerably, Bjarke agreed. How many people had access to your father's private chambers? Family members? Close advisors? Honored guests? Eira's eyes were hard as winter ice. And anyone who had stayed in the hall long enough to learn its layout and routines. Bjarke thought of the wedding guests, the carefully planned seating arrangements that had placed Eric and his party in positions of honor. How many times had the merchant visited the Jarl's hall? How many opportunities had he had to study its defenses, to note the locations of treasures and memorial weapons? Tomorrow, he said, I will face the assembly. But not as a defeated man begging for mercy. What do you mean? Magnus asked. I mean to turn the hunter into the hunted. Bjarke's hand went to his sword hilt, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Eric wants to destroy me using lies and gold? Let him try. But he will face the truth first, and let the assembly judge which weapon proves sharper. Eira struggled to her feet, still leaning on her crutch, but moving with renewed purpose. I will come with you. You are still injured. I am the Jarl's daughter, she said firmly. My voice carries weight in the assembly, and my testimony cannot be easily dismissed. Besides, she lifted Gunnar's axe, its blade catching the firelight. I have evidence to present. Magnus looked between them, seeing the determination that had replaced despair in both their faces. This is dangerous. If you are wrong about Eric, you will have made a powerful enemy for no reason. And if you are right, if we are right, Bjarke finished, then we are already his enemies, and our only choice is whether to die fighting or die running. Eira nodded, her amber pendant catching the light as she moved. My brother's axe has been dishonored long enough. Tomorrow it will serve justice instead of evil. As they settled in for what remained of the night, Bjarke found himself thinking not of the political battle that awaited them, but of the simple fact that Eira had said we instead of you. Somewhere in the past few days, they had stopped being a warrior and a rescued maiden and become something else. Partners, allies, two people facing the storm together, whatever tomorrow brought. They would meet it side by side. The assembly hall buzzed with anticipation as the greatest names in the northern kingdoms gathered to witness what many believed would be Bjarke Thrainsson's final humiliation. Merchants and warriors, jarls and craftsmen, all crowded into the ancient building where disputes had been settled for 3 centuries. Eric the merchant held court near the speaker's platform, surrounded by allies whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of profitable arrangements. His daughter Astrid sat beside him, beautiful as winter sunlight and twice as cold, her eyes fixed on the doors through which her former betrothed must enter. Bjarke arrived as the sun reached its zenith, walking into the hall with Eira at his side and Magnus following close behind. Whispers rippled through the crowd at the sight of them. the giant warrior still bearing the marks of fire and battle. The Jarl's daughter leaning on a crutch, but carrying herself with regal dignity. And between them an intimacy that spoke of bonds forged in crisis. "My lords and ladies," called the assembly speaker, an ancient man whose voice still carried the authority of decades. "We gather to hear the petition of Erik Eriksson, called the Merchant, against Bjarke Thrainsson, called Stoneback, in the matter of a broken marriage contract and demanded compensation." Erik rose from his seat with the confidence of a man who believed victory was assured. In his hands he held a scroll of parchment that crackled with official seals and witness marks. "Honored assembly," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "I come before you seeking justice for a grievous wrong. This man," he pointed dramatically at Bjarke, "swore sacred oaths before gods and men to wed my daughter. Gold was exchanged, contracts sealed, witnesses sworn. Yet when the moment came to honor his word, he fled like a coward, leaving my family shamed before the greatest gathering in memory." Murmurs of agreement came from Erik's supporters, while others maintained careful neutrality. The political mathematics were clear. Erik commanded significant influence, and few were willing to oppose him without compelling reason. "Furthermore," Erik continued, "I have reason to believe this abandonment was not mere cowardice, but calculated treachery. How convenient that raiders should strike the very moment Bjarke disappeared from his wedding. How fortunate that he should arrive just in time to play the hero and win the gratitude of the Jarl's daughter." The accusation hit the assembly like a thunderclap. Even those who had supported Bjarke looked troubled by the implication. To suggest that a warrior of his reputation would orchestrate an attack for personal gain was almost unthinkable, yet the timing was undeniably suspicious. "These are serious charges," the speaker said. "What evidence do you offer?" Erik smiled and gestured to one of his companions, a thin man, with the nervous manner of someone carrying dangerous secrets. "I present Hakon the scribe, who will testify to conversations he witnessed between Bjarke and certain unsavory characters in the weeks before the wedding." Hakon stepped forward, his hands shaking as he unrolled his own parchment. "I was present at the Blue Boar Tavern when Bjarke Thrainsson met with men who claimed to be traders from the Eastern Kingdoms. They spoke in low voices, but I heard mention of payment for services and timing that must be precise." The testimony was damning in its specificity, and Bjarke felt the mood of the assembly shift against him. Faces that had been neutral now showed suspicion, while his enemies looked triumphant. "Furthermore," Hakon continued, "I saw Bjarke provide these men with a map of the fjord settlements, marking the locations of defenses and treasures. That is a lie." Magnus stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "My cousin would never what?" Erik interrupted smoothly. "Would never betray his oath to my daughter. Yet here we stand in the aftermath of exactly such a betrayal." Bjarke remained silent, studying Hakon's nervous face and trembling hands. Something was wrong with the testimony, not just its content, which he knew to be false, but its delivery. The scribe spoke like a man reciting memorized lines, rather than recalling actual events. "These are grave accusations," the speaker said. "How do you answer them, Bjarke Thrainsson?" "With the truth," Bjarke replied, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet hall. "And with evidence that will show this assembly who the real traitor is." He stepped forward and placed Gunnar's war axe on the speaker's table, its stained blade catching the light from the hall's great windows. Gasps rippled through the crowd as many recognized the weapon. This belonged to Eira Skaldsdottir, son of the Jarl, who died defending innocent villagers 2 winters past. It was displayed in his father's hall as a memorial to his sacrifice. Bjarke's voice grew harder. "The raiders took it from its place of honor and used it in their attack. But only someone who had been a guest in the Jarl's hall would know where to find it, would understand its significance." Eira limped forward to stand beside him, her voice ringing with controlled fury. "My brother's weapon was defiled by whoever planned this attack. They wanted us to know that even our most sacred memories could be turned against us." Erik's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. Convenient evidence, easily staged. How do we know this weapon was actually used by the raiders? Perhaps it was planted to support your fabricated story. Because of this, Eira said, and drew from her cloak a piece of parchment that looked different from any official document in the hall. Where the others were clean and formal, this one was stained with soot and blood, its edges charred from fire. A message, she announced, found in the ruins of my father's hall. A message arranging the meeting that drew my father into position for the attack. She unfolded the parchment carefully, and even from a distance, Eric's seal was clearly visible at the bottom. But it was the content that truly mattered, and Eira read it aloud, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. My Lord Jarl, I bring word of new opportunities in the eastern trade routes. Meet me at dawn on the day of the Thrainsson wedding, when the hall will be quiet, and we can speak privately of matters that require discretion. I guarantee you will find my proposals most profitable. Signed with Eric's seal and witnessed by his own scribe, the silence that followed was deafening. Eric's face went from pale to ashen as the implications became clear. He had signed his own name to the document that had lured the Jarl into position for assassination. That is impossible, he stammered. I sent no such message. It must be a forgery. Strange, Bjarke said, his voice deadly calm. Your scribe seems quite skilled at creating false documents. Perhaps we should ask him about his other recent work. All eyes turned to Hakon, who looked as though he might faint. The thin man's nervous manner had transformed into outright terror as he realized the trap closing around him. I wrote only what I was told to write, he whispered. The message, the testimony, all of it was dictated to me. By whom? The speaker demanded. Hakon's eyes darted desperately around the hall, seeking escape or rescue that would not come. By Lord Eric. He said it was necessary to protect the family honor, to ensure the marriage alliance would not be broken by silence. Eric roared, but the damage was done. His own scribe had confessed to forging documents and false testimony at his master's direction. The pieces of the conspiracy tumbled into place like stones in an avalanche. Eric had arranged the attack to remove a political rival, the Jarl whose independence threatened his growing influence. The timing with Bjarke's wedding had been chosen to maximize the chaos and provide cover for the crime, but the plan had gone wrong when Bjarke abandoned his wedding to rescue Eira. Instead of a convenient accident that eliminated the Jarl and his heir, Eric found himself with witnesses and evidence. So he had tried to shift blame to Bjarke himself, using the abandoned wedding as proof of conspiracy. You orchestrated the murder of Jarl Skaldi, Eira said, her voice shaking with rage. You used my father's trust to lure him to his death, then tried to blame the man who saved my life. Eric drew himself up with the last remnants of his dignity. You cannot prove. We can prove everything, Bjarke interrupted. Your forged message, your scribe's false testimony, the timing of the attack, the weapons stolen from the hall you knew so well. He stepped closer, and Eric involuntarily retreated. But most damning of all, your immediate move to claim my lands and exile me. You were prepared for this situation because you created it. The assembly erupted in angry voices as the full scope of Eric's treachery became clear. Jarls, who had considered supporting him now, looked at each other with the horror of those who had nearly been complicit in murder. His purchased allies began to edge away, unwilling to be associated with such monstrous acts. Seize him, commanded the speaker. And Eric found himself surrounded by warriors, loyal to the assembly rather than to gold. As guards moved to arrest the merchant, Bjarke felt Eira's hand slip into his. The forged message that had nearly destroyed them lay on the speaker's table, evidence of treachery, but also of something else. Sometimes the truth was more powerful than any lie, no matter how cleverly constructed. And sometimes justice came not from political maneuvering or purchased loyalty, but from the simple courage to stand and speak what you knew to be right. The real battle, Bjarke realized, was just beginning. The arrest of Eric the merchant sent shockwaves through the assembly that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Within hours, the news had spread across the fjord settlements. carried by riders whose horses kicked up clouds of dust as they raced to inform distant clans of the stunning reversal. But victory in the assembly hall was only the first battle in what promised to be a longer war. Eric's supporters will not accept this quietly, Magnus warned as they gathered in the Thrainsson family longhouse that evening. The great hall that had been prepared for a wedding feast now served as a war council, its decorated walls bearing witness to plans for conflict rather than celebration. Bjarke's mother, Sigrid, sat at the head of the table, her face showing the strain of the past week's revelations. Learning that her son's intended father-in-law was a murderer and conspirator had shaken her deeply, but she remained the practical leader who had guided the clan through difficult times before. 3 merchant families have already declared their intention to honor Eric's trade agreements regardless of his guilt, she reported. They claim his personal crimes do not invalidate legitimate business arrangements. Gold speaks louder than justice, Eira observed from her place beside Bjarke. Her injured arm was healing well, but she still moved carefully, conserving her strength for the battles ahead. It speaks loudest to those who have nothing else to say, Bjarke replied. He was studying a collection of weapons laid out on the table, not for display, but for selection. His massive shield rested against the wall nearby, its iron reinforcement gleaming in the firelight. How many warriors do we command if it comes to fighting? 43 sworn swords, Magnus answered. Perhaps 60 if we count the household guards and older men who can still draw a bow. It was a respectable force for a single clan, but small compared to what Eric's allies might field if they chose open warfare over political maneuvering. The merchant had built his influence carefully over the years, weaving a web of obligations and mutual profit that would not easily be broken by his disgrace. We need allies, Sigrid said. Other clans who have reasons to oppose Eric's network. The Westfjord families have never trusted him, Eira suggested. My father often spoke of their independence, their refusal to accept Eric's trade monopolies. Bjarke nodded, remembering conversations he had overheard during clan gatherings. The Westfjord Jarls were proud men who valued their autonomy above easy profit. They might be willing to stand against Eric's influence if properly approached. I will ride to them tomorrow, he decided. Not alone, Eira said firmly. My voice carries weight with those families. They respected my father, and they will listen to his daughter. You are still injured. I am still the Jarl's heir, she interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. And I will not hide behind walls while others fight for justice in my father's name. As they planned their diplomatic mission, other preparations continued around them. Weapons were cleaned and sharpened, messages prepared for potential allies, and defensive positions scouted in case Eric's supporters chose immediate retaliation. Over patient plotting, it was during these preparations that Eira made a discovery that changed everything she thought. She knew about herself. She had been searching through her father's personal effects, salvaged from the ruins of his hall, when her fingers found something unexpected wrapped in oiled leather at the bottom of a charred wooden box. When she unwrapped it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a sword, not the ornate ceremonial blade she had expected, but a warrior's weapon, its steel dark with age and use. The hilt was wrapped in worn leather that fit her hand as if it had been made for her grip, while the blade itself bore runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. What have you found? Bjarke asked, looking up from his own weapon preparations. I'm not certain. Eira lifted the sword, testing its weight and balance. It moved in her hand like a living thing, perfectly proportioned for her reach and strength. It was hidden in my father's private chest, but I have never seen it before. Magnus joined them, his eyes widening as he saw the blade. Those runes, they are older than anything in our smithies. This weapon has history. Eira turned the sword to catch the firelight, and the runes seemed to glow more brightly. She could not read their meaning, but something deep in her memory stirred at the sight of them, fragments of stories her mother had told her before fever took her away. My mother used to speak of her grandmother, Eira said slowly, working through half-remembered tales. Astrid Eye in Hand, who fought beside the great war chiefs in the southern campaigns. She was said to carry a blade blessed by the old gods themselves. Your great-grandmother was a shield maiden. Bjarke's voice carried surprise and something that might have been admiration. More than that, according to the stories. She was a war leader in her own right, commanding respect from jarls and kings. Eira ran her fingers along the sword's edge, finding it still razor-sharp despite its obvious age. My father never spoke of such things. He believed a daughter should be protected, not trained for battle. But as she held the ancient weapon, Eira felt something awakening within her. Not just the desire for vengeance that had burned since her father's death, but a deeper calling. The sword seemed to recognize her, to approve of her touch in a way that went beyond mere craftsmanship. Perhaps, she said quietly, protection is not always enough. Over the following days, as they prepared for their diplomatic mission to the Vestfjord clans, Eira began training with her ancestral blade. She had learned sword work as a child, of course, what noble's daughter had not, but always as an accomplishment rather than a necessity like music or poetry. This was different. With the ancient sword in her hands, muscle memory seemed to flow from the weapon itself, teaching her stances and techniques that no instructor had ever shown her. The blade moved as if it were part of her arm, responding to intentions before she fully formed them in her mind. Bjarke watched these sessions with growing amazement and something deeper, a recognition that the woman he had rescued from the burning hall was transforming into something he had not expected. The graceful, intelligent daughter of a Jarl was becoming a warrior in her own right, claiming a heritage that had been hidden from her for too long. Your father would be proud, he said after, watching her work through a complex series of forms that left even experienced swordsmen impressed. My father would be horrified. Eira replied with grim humor. He spent my entire life trying to keep me safe, protected from the harsh realities of leadership. If he could see me now, he would see a daughter worthy of her bloodline, Bjarke said firmly. A leader who does not ask others to fight battles she will not face herself. The compliment brought color to her cheeks, but also something else, a confidence that had been growing stronger with each day of training, each moment of preparation for the trials ahead. News from across the region continued to arrive, carried by merchants and travelers who brought word of Eric's supporters rallying to his cause despite his arrest. Gold and influence, it seemed, could overcome even the clearest evidence of treachery in the minds of those whose prosperity depended on maintaining profitable relationships. 2 clans have declared their intention to seek Eric's release, Magnus reported during one of their evening councils. They claim the evidence against him was fabricated, that the assembly was misled by grief and emotion rather than guided by facts. And the others? Sigrid asked, waiting, watching, seeing which way the wind blows before committing themselves. Magnus's expression was grim. Fear is a powerful ally, but it serves all sides equally. It was clear that words alone would not be enough to secure the peace they sought. Eric's network of influence had been built over decades and would not crumble simply because its architect had been exposed as a murderer. Those who profited from his arrangements had too much to lose to accept his downfall without resistance. We leave for the Vestfjord at dawn, Bjarke announced, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. If we cannot prevent war through diplomacy, we must at least ensure we do not face it alone. Eira nodded, her hand resting on the hilt of her ancestral sword. And if diplomacy fails, then we fight, Bjarke said simply. We fight for justice, for truth, and for the right to live free from the corruption that Eric and his allies represent. Together, Eira added, and the word carried weight beyond its simple meaning. They had begun as strangers thrown together by crisis, but had become something more, partners united not just by shared danger but by shared purpose. As they made their final preparations for departure, the ancient sword gleamed in the firelight beside Bjarke's massive shield. 2 weapons, Two warriors, two lives that had found their true meaning not in duty or tradition, but in the choice to stand for what was right. Regardless of the cost, the real battle was about to begin, and they would face it as they had faced everything else since that day of fire and rescue, side by side. With courage as their armor and truth as their banner, tomorrow would bring either victory or destruction, but it would also bring the final test of everything they had chosen to become. The great assembly hall had never seen a gathering quite like this one. Representatives from every major clan in the northern kingdoms packed the ancient building, their voices creating a din that rivaled storms at sea. At the center of it all stood the truth-speaking staff, carved from sacred ash and inlaid with silver runes that caught the light from 100 torches. Whoever held the staff commanded absolute attention and absolute accountability for their words. Bjarke and Eira had returned from the Westfjord with 12 allied clans standing behind them, their banners bright with promise of support. But Eric's faction had not been idle either. Despite his imprisonment, his network of influence had rallied to challenge the Assembly's verdict and demand his release. "This tribunal is unprecedented," declared Jarl Thorson of the Eastern Reaches, one of Eric's most vocal supporters. His weathered face showed the skepticism of a man who had profited greatly from the merchants' arrangements. To retry a case already decided sets a dangerous precedent. "The precedent was set when corruption was allowed to take root in our councils," replied Jarl Gunhild of the Westfjord, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never bent knee to merchants or their gold. "Justice delayed is justice denied." The assembly speaker, ancient and seemingly fragile, but possessed of unshakable authority, raised the truth-speaking staff. Silence fell immediately, as profound as if the great hall had been emptied of life. "We gather not to retry what has been decided," he announced, his voice somehow carrying to every corner of the massive space, "but to hear new evidence that has come to light. Evidence that may reshape our understanding of recent events." Bjarke felt Eira tense beside him. They had debated long into the night whether to reveal what they had discovered. During their diplomatic mission information that transformed Eric's conspiracy from a crime of opportunity into something far more sinister. Lord Bjarke Thrainsson, the speaker continued, "You have petitioned this assembly to hear testimony regarding additional crimes committed by the accused. Present your evidence." Bjarke rose and walked toward the speaker's platform, conscious of hundreds of eyes following his movement. In his hands, he carried a leather portfolio that contained documents more damning than any they had presented before. "Honored assembly," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "What we discovered about Eric's attack on Eira Skaldsdottir was only the beginning. During our travels to the Westfjord, we learned of a pattern of crimes stretching back 5 years, murders, thefts, and betrayals, all designed to consolidate power in the hands of one man and his allies." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but the truth-speaking staff commanded continued attention. "We present the testimony of witnesses who were afraid to speak before, families threatened into silence, servants who saw too much, traders who carried messages they were told never to repeat." Bjarke opened the portfolio and withdrew the first document. Beginning with the death of Jarl Magnus the Wise, 3 years passed. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Magnus the Wise had been beloved throughout the region, his death from fever mourned by all. To suggest it had been murder rather than natural causes sent shockwaves through the assembly. "That is monstrous slander," shouted one of Eric's supporters. "Magnus died of plague. Everyone knows this." "Everyone knows what they were told," Eira said, rising from her seat. She moved with the fluid grace of someone no longer hiding her warrior training, her ancestral sword visible at her side. "But the healer who tended him in his final days has now come forward with a different story." She gestured toward the witness gallery, where an elderly woman sat with the bearing of someone who had seen too much death to be easily intimidated. Grandmother Solveig served as healer to 5 jarls over 40 years. "She knows the difference between plague and poison," The healer stood, her voice quavering with age, but firm with conviction. The symptoms were wrong for plague. The progression, the color of his skin, the way his body rejected all food. I have seen such things before, in times of war when enemies sought to eliminate leaders without open battle. And what silenced you before now? The speaker asked. Fear, Solveig replied simply. My granddaughter was threatened. My son's trade agreement suddenly cancelled. I understood the message. Speak of what I suspected, and my family would suffer. Who delivered these threats? Bjarke asked, though he already knew the answer. Men in Eric's service. They said their master was grateful for my discretion and would show that gratitude through continued prosperity for my bloodline. The implications hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. If Magnus the Wise had been murdered, it meant Eric's conspiracy reached back years before the attack on Jarl Skaldi. It meant they were dealing not with a single crime of passion, but with a systematic campaign to eliminate opposition. There is more, Bjarke continued, producing another document. The unexpected death of Jarl Ragnar's heir in a hunting accident. The mysterious fire that destroyed Jarl Olaf's grain stores just before harvest. The plague of cattle that struck only those farmers who refused Eric's price controls. Each revelation struck the assembly like a hammer blow. What had seemed like unrelated misfortunes began to form a pattern of deliberate destruction aimed at anyone who stood in Eric's way. For 5 years, Eira said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall, we have been slowly strangled by a spider's web of corruption and fear. My father's death was not the beginning. It was simply the moment when the mask finally slipped. The truth-speaking staff trembled in the ancient speaker's hands. Whether from age or emotion, none could say. Around the hall, faces that had been skeptical now showed horror as the scope of Eric's crimes became clear. But it was what happened next that transformed the assembly. From a place of judgment into a battleground, the attack came without warning, as the best ones always do. Eric's eldest son, Bjorn, burst through the assembly hall's great doors at the head of 30 armed men, their weapons already drawn and their intentions clear. The carefully orchestrated legal proceeding dissolved into chaos as nobles dove for cover, and the clash of steel on steel rang through the ancient space. Seize the traitors, Bjorn shouted, his sword pointing directly at Bjarke and Eira. My father rots in chains, while liars poison this assembly with fabricated evidence. The attack had been planned with military precision. Half of Bjorn's men moved to block the exits, while the others advanced toward the speaker's platform, where the truth-speaking staff lay abandoned. Their goal was clear: capture or kill those who threatened Eric's network. Then claim the assembly had been taken by outlaws seeking to spread chaos, but they had not counted on Eira. The Jarl's daughter moved like water flowing over stone, her ancestral sword appearing in her hand with fluid grace. The ancient blade sang as it cut through the air, meeting the first attacker's weapon with a ring that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. Protect the staff, she called to Bjarke, already engaging 2 more enemies who sought to flank her position. Bjarke needed no encouragement. His massive shield came up just in time to deflect a spear thrust aimed at his heart, while his axe found the ribs of the man who had thrown it. The giant warrior fought like a force of nature, his movements economical but devastating. Around them, the assembly erupted into its own battle as Eric's supporters revealed their true allegiances. Hidden weapons appeared from beneath fine cloaks, and what had seemed like a civilized gathering transformed into a melee that would have been more at home on a battlefield. Magnus fought beside his cousin, his sword dancing in patterns that spoke of years of training and battlefield experience. The best fjord Jarls who had allied with them formed a defensive line, their shields locked and their spears leveled against the attackers. But it was Eira who truly turned the tide. Her great-grandmother's sword moved with a will of its own, guided by instincts that seemed to flow from the weapon itself. She fought with a grace and deadly precision that left even experienced warriors amazed, her blade finding gaps in armor that should not have existed, deflecting strikes that should have been impossible to see coming. Which One of Eric's men screamed as her sword passed through his guard like morning mist. "She fights with dark magic." "She fights with the blessing of her ancestors," Bjarke replied, his axe taking the man's head from his shoulders. "And that is magic enough." The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Bodies fell on both sides, noble blood mixing with common on the ancient stones. The truth-speaking staff lay at the center of it all, its silver runes seeming to glow with their own light, as if the very concept of justice had taken physical form. Bjorn himself fought his way toward Eira, his face twisted with the rage of someone who saw his family's carefully built empire crumbling around him. He was skilled, Bjarke had to admit, perhaps, the best swordsman in Eric's service, but skill alone was no match for the combination of ancestral weapon and awakened heritage that Eira now commanded. Their blades met in a shower of sparks that lit up the dim hall. Bjorn's sword was good steel, well-maintained and expertly wielded, but Eira's ancestral blade was something else entirely. Each clash sent vibrations through both weapons, and gradually, impossibly, cracks began to appear in Bjorn's blade. "Yield," Eira said, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "Your father's crimes are exposed. This fight serves nothing but pride." "Pride is all we have left," Bjorn snarled, pressing his attack with desperate fury. But desperation was no substitute for skill, and pride was a poor shield against justice. Eira's next strike shattered his sword completely, the broken blade ringing like a bell as it hit the stones. Her ancestral weapon came to rest at his throat, its point steady despite the battle still raging around them. "Enough!" The ancient speaker's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. Somehow, the elderly man had remained upright throughout the battle, the truth-speaking staff still clutched in his hands. "Let all who would hear bear witness. Justice will not be denied." The words carried an authority that transcended mere mortal command. One by one, the fighters stopped their struggles, turning toward the speaker with the automatic obedience that generations of tradition had bred into their bones. "Eric's son has revealed the true nature of his father's supporters," the speaker continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "They would make this sacred hall run red with blood rather than accept the judgment of law. They stand condemned by their own actions." Around the hall, Eric's surviving supporters found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. The neutrals who had wavered before now saw clearly where their loyalties should lie, while the allies Bjarke and Eira had gathered stood firm in their conviction. "The crown of the Jarl," Eira said quietly, looking at Bjorn, who knelt before her with his broken sword. "By right of blood and trial by combat, I claim it." She looked toward where her father's ceremonial crown had been placed with the other evidence, its gold and silver seeming to catch every ray of light in the dim hall. It was more than mere jewelry. It was the symbol of legitimate authority, the right to speak for her people and lead them toward a better future. Justice had been served. But the greater work of rebuilding what Eric's corruption had destroyed was only just beginning. 3 months after the battle in the assembly hall, the first ships of spring brought news that Eric the merchant had died in his prison cell. Whether from grief, poison, or simple old age, none could say for certain. His passing marked the end of an era, not just of his influence, but of the old ways of conducting business through fear and corruption. The fjord settlements had changed in the aftermath of the revelations. Trade agreements were renegotiated on fairer terms. Long-silenced voices found their courage to speak, and a new generation of leaders emerged to replace those who had been eliminated by Eric's conspiracy. At the center of it all stood Eira Skaldsdottir, now Jarl in her own right, her father's crown resting easily on her brow as if it had always belonged there. She ruled with a firm hand tempered by wisdom, and her first official act had been to establish a new code of justice that protected the weak from the predations of the powerful. Bjarke found her in the newly rebuilt Great Hall, standing before the fire with the same expression of thoughtful concentration she had worn as a child when puzzling out complex problems. Her ancestral sword hung at her side, no longer a hidden relic, but a visible symbol of the warrior heritage she had claimed. "The Westfjord clans have agreed to the Mutual Defense Pact," she said without turning around. She always seemed to know when he approached, as if their bond in battle had created some invisible connection between them. "And the trade agreements with the southern kingdoms? Finalized this morning. We will prosper, but not at the expense of our neighbors." She turned then, and he saw in her face the confidence that had grown from girl to woman to leader in the space of a season. "It seems we have succeeded in building something better from the ashes of the old." The rebuilt hall was smaller than her father's had been, but somehow more welcoming. Where the original had been designed to impress visitors with displays of wealth and power, this one spoke of community and shared purpose. The walls were decorated not with captured weapons, but with tools of craftsmanship, symbols of creation rather than destruction. "There is something I want to show you," Bjarke said, producing a simple wooden object from beneath his cloak. It was a drinking horn, carved from common oak rather than exotic walrus tusk, decorated not with silver wire but with simple patterns that spoke of honest craft rather than ostentatious display. The wood was warm to the touch and smooth from careful finishing, beautiful in its very simplicity. "I made it myself," he said, suddenly feeling uncertain in a way that no battlefield had ever made him feel. "I thought, that is, if you would consider—" Eira took the horn from his hands, turning it over to examine the craftsmanship. Her fingers traced the carved patterns with the same care she might have shown an ancient relic, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with understanding. "Are you asking me to marry you, Bjarke Thrainsson? I am asking if you would consider binding your life to that of a man who has nothing to offer but his sword, his loyalty, and his love." The words came easier than he had expected, carrying the weight of truth that made them impossible to retract. "I have no lands to speak of, no great wealth or political connections, just myself and the promise that I will never leave you to face any burden alone." She was quiet for a long moment, the horn cradled in her hands like something precious. Outside, the sounds of rebuilding continued, hammers on wood, voices calling instructions, the everyday noise of a community healing itself. "Do you remember," she said finally, "what I asked you in the burning hall, when the timber had me trapped and the roof was coming down?" "Please don't leave me," he replied without hesitation. "And do you remember what you answered?" "Never." "Then ask me again." She held out the horn to him, her expression solemn, but her eyes dancing with barely suppressed joy. "Ask me properly this time, with the words that matter." Bjarke took the horn, feeling its weight and warmth, understanding finally what she wanted to hear. Not a formal proposal weighted down with politics and obligations, but the simple truth that had driven him from his wedding feast to rescue her from the flames. "Eira Skaldsdottir," he said, "will you share this cup with me? Will you let me stand beside you through whatever storms may come? Will you trust me never to leave you, and let me trust you never to leave me?" "Yes," she said simply, and the words seemed to contain all the hope and promise that the future might hold. They drank from the horn together, the mead sweet on their tongues and warm in their throats. It was not the elaborate ceremony that had been planned for Bjarke's first wedding, with its political implications and hundreds of witnesses. Instead, it was just the two of them and the truth they had discovered in fire and battle, that some bonds were stronger than duty, some choices more important than safety, and some loves worth any sacrifice. When Magnus arrived an hour later with news from the capital, he found them still standing by the fire, the simple horn between them, and expressions of quiet contentment on their faces. "I take it congratulations are in order?" he said, smiling at the obvious happiness that surrounded them like an aura. "The simplest ceremonies are often the most binding," Eira replied, her hand finding Bjarke's with the natural ease of long practice. "And the most honest," Bjarke added, thinking of the ornate wedding horn that had once symbolized everything he was supposed to want. This simple wooden cup represented something far more valuable, a choice made freely, A love given willingly, a partnership built on respect rather than obligation. Outside, the fjord sparkled in the afternoon sun, its waters carrying ships bearing honest trade rather than corruption and fear. The settlements along its shores buzzed with the activity of people building rather than merely surviving, creating rather than simply enduring. It was, Bjarke reflected, a good day to begin a new life. The best day he could imagine for starting the rest of his story, not as the dutiful heir to an arranged marriage, but as the willing partner of a woman who had taught him that sometimes the most important choice was simply to stay when others would run. They had found their way home at last, not to a place but to each other, and that was enough. More than enough, it was everything.